Wonderful. Well, we're so excited you're here. We're just going to get started. This is a jam-packed hour, and so we want to make sure we have enough time to get into a good conversation after we look at some analysis. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Amy McIsaac. I am the Managing Director of Learning and Experimentation at PACE. We're so glad you joined us for this conversation, should we say racial equity. I'll get into the project for a minute, but just to say, this is a question that I feel like all roads lead us back to. We know how much folks, particularly in the civic space, are really wrestling with the signals, the assumptions, the meanings behind a term like racial equity, which is one of the reasons we prioritized it in our research, and another reason why we really wanted to make sure we highlighted the many layers of exploration of this term in a webinar like this. I want to make sure two housekeeping things are on your radar. One is that I have two colleagues on the line with us, Bhumika Shah and Kevin Singer. Both of them are going to be able to help with any logistics you have about today's webinar. We will be providing the recording and the deck that we'll be looking through for the analysis as a recap afterwards. So don't worry about capturing things. This will all be available to you in the next couple of days. The other thing is that I'm classically just bad at managing a chat while I'm also presenting. So if you're asking me a question, I probably will not see it until later in the hour. If you have a question, though, feel free to pop it in and I'll be able to get to it. And then Bhumika and Kevin will also be keeping an eye on it if it's something logistical related. Great. So with that, let's hop in. For those of you who are new, some of you have been on this journey with us, but if you're new, just want to stage set a little bit and give you a sense of who PACE is. PACE is a philanthropic laboratory for funders. We have about 75 grant-making funding institutions who are members of PACE, and they all kind of come at democracy and civic engagement from a different angle, but the thing they all have in common is that they are trying to advance democracy and civic life in the United States. We've been around for close to 20 years, and for about a quarter of that time, we have been on a civic language perceptions learning journey and running some research on it. And just to give you a little arc of that journey, we started 5 years ago, and really we heard from our members at the time, again, grant makers in this space, that they felt like there was some coded and loaded nature of the civic terms that was starting to become a problem. And how do they understand that better? So we thought to ourselves, well, great, we'll go out and find you the research that'll help you understand that better. And it turns out there was not a lot of research or conversation about the actual words that we use in our democracy and civic life. And so we looked into it really in a very scratch the surface way in 2019. Then the question was evolving a little bit, and our funder members were really talking about this disconnect, this idea that I think I'm saying something and I'm talking right past somebody, like we are not connecting. So help me understand what I should say instead. And so that was the year that we ran in 2021 a 5,000 person nationally representative survey of Americans' perceptions and really went deeper into some of those questions. And we thought we solved civic language and we were all good to go. But of course, the questions got more nuanced and frankly, a little bit more urgent. In 2023, the language and the questions coming to us sounded a little bit more like the coded and loaded nature of civic terms has become untenable. Are there even words I can say anymore? And this might be a question that you have asked yourself as well, and maybe what brings you here today. But we designed the survey in this round to really help us understand the signals that Americans are sending or receiving when they hear these terms. So just a little background in where you're meeting us in our process of learning and exploration on this topic. We actually designed this survey, this round of the research last fall. And we were in survey collection mode in November of 2023. We spent, the end of 2023 collecting and then doing some early analysis of what we found. And then we kind of make it a habit of releasing our data to the public, which we did in March of 2024, so that you can be in the data while we are in the data, and we're all in the data trying to figure out what does all of this mean. And there's just a real flurry of learning and activity for about 6 or 7 months, which is where we are right now, kind of right in the middle of that. leading us to a place where we will kind of make sense of everything we learn together and issue a report. We're figuring out what that really is going to look like, but something in September that distills our largest learnings and takeaways from all of this co-learning with the field. And we wanted to do that in enough time that we could make really have a resource and be a support for folks thinking about the election. So a little bit more about the survey itself. What I think is important to know, this is the survey that undergirds all of our analysis that we're going to look at together about the term racial equity. It was 5,000 registered US voters. That's important to note. These are registered voters who filled out our survey. The design choice behind that I can get into if you'd like. It has to do with the design choices we made in previous surveys and making sure we could hold apples to apples. But with 70% of Americans registered to vote in 2022, we knew we weren't getting the full American story, but we were getting a pretty good chunk of it. So 5,000 registered US voters, nationally representative sample, and this was in the field in November of 2023. What's important to note about that time is that it was also 2 years before in November in 2021 that we were in the field with a very similar survey. So you'll see some of that in the analysis. We're seeing kind of a 2-year snapshot on some of these words, which has been really valuable analysis for us. And we worked with Citizen Data, who many of you probably know, wonderful thought leader, wonderful partner in helping us get the research we need around civic language and many topics for other organizations. So just to get your brain into the terms themselves, in the light purple box, you see the 21 terms that we surveyed. We did organize them as categories. So there were 7 terms in each category. Each survey participant got one cluster that they looked at for the length of the survey. So we're going to be focusing a lot in this webinar on that racial equity cluster, obviously because the term racial equity is in that cluster, but just to know that there were 2 other clusters that Americans also looked at. And then we captured, of course, a ton of demographic and identities and experience markers. So you see all of that in the white box below. Anything that's bolded on the slide is something we captured in 2021 and recaptured in 2023. So those are your hooks for kind of looking at things over time. Everything else that's not highlighted or bolded, that means it was a kind of new in 2023 and gives us some new ways to look at some of this information. There were 49 questions in the survey. This really distills down the way we were thinking about the design. And just to give you guys an orientation to it, there were a set of questions that just got us straight impressions from Americans on the words: positive, negative, unfamiliar, neutral. There was a set of questions that forced Americans to tell us, okay, of the ones you're looking at, which is your number one, which is your most positive? So it's really a forced choice there, and then help us understand why. Same on the negative, your forced choice on negativity and why. And then we had a series of questions that were trying to understand really Americans' relationships to these terms. So are they motivating Americans to action? Do they feel like these terms are meant for them? Do they feel like they have unifying potential, bringing people together or driving them apart? So that's just a really quick orientation to all the things that this survey can do. And we're going to be going into bits and pieces of this as we go. So let's warm up before we go into the analysis, because it would be irresponsible to go in cold, right? So warming up here, we have the 7 words that are in the racial equity cluster on the right side of your screen. And what I'd love to do is first just hear from you. Our question 24 in the survey read, which one of the following terms do you have the most positive feeling towards? So again, this was the forced choice question. Americans had to pick one of these in this cluster to say this is their most positive. I'd love in the chat if you could populate it and go ahead and give me a quick chat. If you had to guess which one of these words Americans said was their most positive word. Let's see some guesses in the chat. Unity, unity. You guys are pretty unified about unity, civility. Okay, yep. Very good. You guys are all in the right zone. So the most positive word choice for this cluster was equality, but it was only 0.2 of a point more often selected than unity. So if you said unity, you're right there. It was very, very, very close. Let's do it now for the negativity. So which of these words did Americans pick as their most negative word? Go ahead and give me some guesses in the chat. Social justice, diversity, racial equity. I see someone picked a couple words there. Yep. Yep, you're in the right zone as well. And you're right. Here we're seeing social justice as the most frequently selected negative term for Americans at 28.4%. So now that you've let that kind of sit on your eyes, what we're going to do for the next stretch is I'm going to go over some analysis. And this analysis was really kind of thought through in a couple questions. Then we're going to go into a conversation because we really want to get to the question of this webinar. Should we say racial equity? That is going to be where we spend most of the time. But as an input to that conversation, we posed 3 questions. What do Americans think of the term racial equity in general? We want to understand why Americans hold the perceptions they do of racial equity. And then we're going to get into how Americans define racial equity. So really some juicy areas here for us to dig into. And let's go into this first question about how Americans think about the term racial equity generally first. So the first slide we're going to look at is our overall snapshot of all of the 21 terms and the impressions Americans told us they held of these 21 terms. The purple bar is showing you where they're positive, the orange bar where they're negative, neutral's in the gray, and unfamiliar is in the yellow. And these words are ranked on the left side from most positive to least positive. So overall, my takeaway from a slide like this is Americans are mostly positive on these terms. We do see some terms where Americans are showing us a little more negativity, a little more unfamiliarity, but overall, mostly positive. And that is true also for a word like racial equity. Racial equity is on the bottom third of this chart. So sure, we're seeing it not as positive, but just to give you guys those numbers here, 54% of Americans choosing between their options, this was not a select all that apply, they had to choose one, chose I have a positive impression of the term racial equity. About 3% were unfamiliar, 23% neutral, and 20% negative. So really positive to see low unfamiliarity in my book. And we still see more positivity than we see, frankly, neutrality or negativity combined. But that wasn't the whole story we wanted to look into. So we also said, okay, but who has a positive impression of racial equity? And do we see a more nuanced story when we look at the subgroups? And so what you're seeing here is the national sample set, as you saw on the last slide, was 54% positive. But then we went category by category, by age, education, gender. You can see the list at the bottom. And we started to say, okay, where are these groups on positivity of the term racial equity? And do we see some groups driving positivity more than others? And here, anything in orange is showing you slightly either above the 54%, anything in purple below. And so we see a group like older Americans, conservatives, folks who identify as Hispanic, Latino, Latina, and rural as below that line. Other folks are telling us they have a higher impression of the term racial equity. So I think it's important to see this, this demographic story that's behind these impressions as well. This chart I'm going to take a beat on because it actually, I know it's a lot for you to see visually. Let me take a minute to orient you. And then I think it's actually telling us something really important. So what we wanted to do was look at, okay, but how does a term like racial equity and really all the terms we looked at in 2021 and then looked at again in 2022. So looking at that 2-year picture, where are we seeing impressions and perceptions change? And so anything that's in that hot red, the hotter the color, the bigger the increase. Anything in that cool blue, anything cool, that is telling us that is a bigger decrease. And so you look at something like the positivity column, which is all the way to the left, we see that our terms over 2 years on the whole got more positive. Where folks got the biggest decreases was in neutrality and then again in unfamiliarity. And so what we see here is a trend in which over the 2 years, for the words overall that we tested twice, people got more positive and more negative. They got less neutral and less unfamiliar. So people know these words more than they did 2 years ago, and they have feelings that they could pin to more than they did 2 years ago. More often than not, that feeling is positive, but some of the words we are seeing more negative. You look at a word like diversity at the bottom there, the rate for negativity went up at a higher rate than it did for positivity. And that is the true storyline as well for racial equity. Racial equity's positivity went up almost 10 percentage points. Its negativity went up almost 3 percentage points. And then we saw a decrease in unfamiliarity and a decrease in neutrality. So this is just a really interesting chart for us to consider. It's like people on the whole got more familiar and less neutral on these words, and they really went to one of the camps, negative or positive, and more so on the positive. As somebody who works in the civic field and thinks a lot about the language and the messaging and the narratives that are out there, to me, this is a really good news chart. It feels like in the last 2 years, there has really been a needle moved. So let's move to our next question that we'll consider together. And this one's a bit of a doozy. Why Americans hold the perceptions they do of racial equity. This was the whole point of us going into another chapter of this civic language research, was we wanted to understand the why underneath these perceptions that Americans hold. And what we're going to do in this section is take a bite of the apple from a few different angles. So we're going to kind of switch mental gears as we navigate through this section. The first one I want to look at is there was a question in the survey that asked folks, do you believe this term is meant for you? And there are a couple options people could select, a gradation between fully meant for me and fully meant for someone else. And there was, somewhat meant for me, somewhat meant for someone else, et cetera, all in between. But if we just look at those polars, so people who said racial equity is fully meant for me, or people who said racial equity is fully meant for someone else, so they do not see themselves within that term, we see a really interesting story emerge. The purple line is charting for you within demographic categories where Americans told us they felt like racial equity was for someone else. The orange line is where people told us it's meant for me, fully meant for me. Overall, Americans felt like a term like racial equity was more meant for someone else than for them, right? We see 16%, that's that orange dotted line, lower than the 23% that purple dotted line. But if you look by category, you're seeing some interesting sub-stories here. So young people, liberals, Asian, Blacks, Hispanic, Latino, Latinas, and then urban groups, these folks were telling us that they see racial equity as a term more for them than they do for someone else. So they see themselves inside that term. By gender and education, so that like kind of middle of the graph here, we don't see a lot of difference, right? By gender and by education, we're not seeing these big variances. The line's somewhat straightish, and it never crosses. So we do see kind of a consistent story when we're leading with our education or our gender identities, for this word is mostly meant for someone else, more so than meant for me. The only racial group that does not see it more for them than for someone else is white people. So I think that's really interesting to see. And I think this is a really profound graph for us to sit with and consider, and tells us a lot of sub-stories about, okay, who really feels a sense of ownership of a term like racial equity? And that is one way for us to understand why do Americans hold the perceptions they do. So now let's go into the reasons themselves. Like I said, there were some questions that let us get to why do you hold this perception? So I'm going to get you there, but first let me give you some background that lays the road for us. So during our warm-up, we did these questions. What is your most positive word in this list? What is your most negative word in this list? And you guys got it mostly right. So you're in the right kind of headspace of where Americans were on these terms, but wanted also to give you this graphic that breaks down the rate of frequency that Americans were choosing words in this cluster as their most negative or their most positive. And so we see a term like racial equity, which is plotted here at the bottom as the second most negative word for Americans selected. And then it is it's in the last place for positive. It's not often chosen as a positive word for Americans compared to the other ones offered, but it's just shy of advocacy. So it's just right there with advocacy. So interesting story here. We thought to ourselves, okay, but is this because certain racial or ethnic groups feel certain ways? And we just saw a chart that there was some variances there. What's that story? And is that causing some of these bars to be bigger than others? So we looked at that. And we do not see much variance when we look at the racial breakdown. And of course, I'm just looking at 4 racial and ethnic groups here, fully acknowledging that there's a lot more that we even captured in our survey, but these were the ones that had the N that was big enough for us to do the kind of analysis we were trying to do here. And what we see is under 3% variance in negativity. So these groups were selecting racial equity as their most negative word at pretty similar rates of selection. We don't see that story on positivity as much. So we see a bigger variance here. Black or African American people were telling us that they are selecting racial equity as their most positive word at a higher rate than white people, Hispanic, Latina, and Asian American, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. So slightly different story here, but I think it's really interesting to see the negativity being somewhat similar across the board. Now, of course, here we are seeing negativity at higher rates than positivity, but across the variance, we see a smaller variance. Okay, so let's get into the why. Between question 24 and 26 was question 25 and 27. And basically what you should know here is, what is your most positive word in 24? And then question 25 asked, okay, these are some reasons that you may be positive towards this word. Please select 3 or none of the above that more closely align with why you hold a positive feeling towards this, and then repeat it again for negative. What's really important to note is that the options that people had to select why they were positive or negative on a term were parallel. So people could select, I'm positive on this term because, like on this chart, the term goes against, oh, sorry, I'm negative because the term goes against my personal values. And on the positive side, the term reflects my personal values. The term makes me feel fearful about the future. The term makes me feel hopeful about the future. So the exact same options, just shaped in the positive or the negative. And I think this is a really interesting chart for us to consider. So for people who selected racial equity as either their most negative or their most positive word, we see a very interesting story about why they're holding these perceptions. On the negative side, we see the outsized, maybe not outsized, but we see the influence of politicians in the media in the way they are portraying racial equity, and that contributing to a negative impression, a negative feeling towards that word for Americans. We also see the term makes me feel fearful about the future, and I have a negative experience of this term. So those were the ones that were really kind of up there for why Americans were selecting racial equity as their most negative feelings term. On the positive side, we see a different story. We see Americans selecting racial equity as their most positive term because it reflects their personal values and it makes them feel hopeful about the future. So there's definitely something going on here in terms of the ways that racial equity aligns with values and gives a sense of hope. And then on the negative side, the way other people are shaping the narrative around racial equity, contributing to the negative feelings. The other thing I want to point out on this slide is the confidence bar. So it's about midway on your chart here. Um, I- it's about middle of the road on both positive and negative, but I think that's also telling. The fact that Americans are telling us the reason I don't feel good about this word is because I'm not confident in using it, and I am confident in using it. There's definitely something there for us to explore. I think there's a lot of room here and a lot of signals I'm hearing, and I feel like I'm receiving from a chart like this about Americans' openness, but also just shakiness about a term like this. Again, we wanted to look at the reasons by race and ethnic breakdown. So again, are we seeing something different when we look at different groups of people and their reasons for being negative or positive on a term like racial equity? So there's 4 things I want to point out on this slide. The first is in the upper right-hand corner, the experiences of the term. Really interesting for me to see that there is a pretty big variance between different racial and ethnic groups' experiences of the term contributing to their positivity of racial equity as a term. Also on the negative side, we see that for sure with Black or African Americans kind of spiking there, but we see this interesting gradation happening on the positive side that feels noteworthy to me. Second is in the bottom right-hand corner, people thought of. So you might remember from the last slide, people could say, this term makes me think of people I like, or this term makes me think of people I dislike. And I think it's great to see that it's making people think of people they like more than people they don't like, contributing to their negativity. I think there's something there for us to explore. And what's noteworthy here is we have not seen this happen for all the other terms we've looked at. Really noteworthy for those of you who were with us in the, should we say, patriotism webinar, the number one reason people were negative on patriotism was it made them think of people they disliked from the liberal side of things. So liberals were saying that about people they disliked. So the fact that we can see words behaving in a way that the people they think of can really make a difference, we're not seeing that here, particularly on the negativity side of things, which to me feels like a really good note. It sticks out to me in the left column, third one down, personal values, that white people, this is their number one choice. The reason that I'm positive on this term is because it aligns with my personal values more than anything else here. And honestly, and two, we see here at a higher rate than the other groups. So that's interesting. And then going back up to the top of the left column here, confidence in using the term. Again, I'm still kind of looking at this and I'm curious about it. We see here kind of pretty consistent look across the racial groups with Asian American, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders kind of spiking in both the positive and the negative confidence there. But I don't see like this like explosive variance that we see in some of the other areas. So I think that's interesting too. Okay, so last bite of this apple is that we wanted to understand what this word does in people or how people perceive this word doing something in their lives. And does that make a difference in why Americans hold the term, hold the impression they do of the term? So this chart is mapping all of our 21 words. But what we did was on the y-axis, we wanted to see, oh goodness, now I'm forgetting. Okay, on the horizontal axis, please don't call me out if I did that wrong. Rate of selection as most negative term. So as people were selecting this, yep, this is my most negative one of the ones I'm looking at. That was going higher. And then on the horizontal axis, it's perception that term drives people apart a lot. So people could select, does this word do you perceive this word to bring people apart or drive them apart? Sorry, bring people together or drive them apart with gradation in between. And the more people said it drives people apart a lot, I definitely think it drives people apart. We were going further along. So what you can see then is in that top right quadrant, these were the terms in orange that Americans told us, I have a lot of negativity towards this word, and I think it drives people apart a lot. This is one way we're trying to explore which of our terms are most polarizing, which we get asked all the time. This is one way to look at that. And we do see racial equity in that quadrant as a term that Americans perceive to be driving people apart a lot and more often select as one of their more negative words. But again, is there a sub-story there we need to pay attention to? And so who thinks racial equity drives people apart a lot? And this is a very similar chart, but inversed from what we looked at in the chart about, is this term meant for you or meant for someone else? So we see here conservatives, white people, rural folks, older folks, they do not think this term, they did not think this term was for them, and they also think it's driving people apart. Younger folks, urban folks, people of color, they thought the word was for them. They thought racial equity was for them. And they're also less likely to think it drives people apart. So I think, again, a whole world to explore here, but wanted to make sure we saw this sub-story here of the demographic look. Okay, last part we're going to look into was how Americans define racial equity. And this is, I think, going to be a really good tee up for our speakers, particularly Veronica, who we'll introduce in a minute, because she's also done a look at this through her research. And so what you should know is that the last question of our survey, Q49, said racial equity can be defined in several different ways. In a few words, please describe how you understand it. And so we have hundreds of Americans writing out for us their elaboration of racial equity. Fascinating read if you're ever looking for a read. In this question, folks got the one word that was kind of the power word of their cluster. So of each of the 5,000 survey respondents, there were 3 words served up. So about a third of the survey population engaged with racial equity as a term. So when we looked at all of these write-in responses, there's 1,678, again, a third of the overall sample. Of those people who elaborated on their definition, 95% reported English as their first language. 11 words on average were used to define racial equity for Americans, and the median number was 9 words. So we're about 10 words. Americans needed about 10 words to define 12 letters. I think that's important to note too. And we've been talking a lot at PACE lately about the pressure we put on words to encapsulate large gulfs of meaning. And I think we start to see that here as well. The longest definition was 110 words. God bless that person. The shortest definition was 1 word. It showed up a couple of times. It was either like diversity, equal, that sort of flavor. I have poured over all of these definitions. Again, fascinating read. And what I want you to know from all of that, saving you the Spark Notes here, is that about 80% of what was written in was a definition. There were, of course, some personal statements and stories people shared, some political statements and stories, and also some people just saying, like, I don't know what this means. And even some elaboration on why they don't know what it means. So I think there's like a real rich data set there for us to look at too as a field. And then we did just straight word counts on the data set here. So you could get a sense of what were the other words showing up in these definitions most frequently. We see equal being the leader in that group, race, races, people, treated, racial. So versions of these concepts we're talking about, but wanted you to see kind of that word count that we were able to pull out from these definitions. So what were the definitions? What were people saying? Let me start by saying they were all over the place. They were all over the place. In many ways, I was very shocked by what people wrote. In many ways, I was deeply touched by what people wrote. I wanted to connect with people afterwards. I was like, can I get their email? A lot of need to follow up. I wanted to correct in some places. So there was a lot to look at. What you're looking at here is a synthesis that I did not do. We put it through ChatGPT and we said, what are you seeing, robot, as the big themes in these definitions? And so I won't go over these in kind of detail here, but you can let this wash over you. Definitely a lot about equality and fairness, unity and inclusion, eliminating discrimination. There's a fair amount of acknowledging historical inequities. Definitely a perspective in the definitions around no preferential treatments. And I think too, a real application of the word in the definitions. So folks really applying it in the workplace or applying it in their lived experience of American democracy or applying it in schools. That really came out to me as I poured over these definitions, was like people are really thinking about it as applied to something that they have experience of in their life. So that is a crash course of what we see when we go into our data to really sit with what are the dynamics and the signals that racial equity is presenting and how are Americans in relationship to this word and how are they perceiving it. Let's get back to the original question of why you all joined this webinar. Okay, but like, should we say racial equity? And we know there's so much interest in this term. We just saw it in the data, the way it is sending signals left, right, and center. And as we've been out and about with this research over the last couple of years, and most specifically the last couple of months, I have really felt 2 camps. I've observed 2 camps emerging around the question of should we say racial equity. I see on one side people saying that they want to use the term more, that they recognize it might be a little polarizing. It may not be for everyone, but I'm going to try to overcome assumptions. I'm going to work extra hard to make it feel embraced by more communities. We cannot give up on this word. Then I hear another camp, and I want to be clear, I'm setting up a binary just for simplicity, but there's a million gradations in between here. People who are thinking about using racial equity less, and they're trying to find new ways, different ways to convey the same meanings, but not use the term racial equity. And so, for example, I received an email just a couple weeks ago from a partner we had been working with, which I think is pretty emblematic of the issue for many people. And this is, it read, racial equity consistently has high negativity ratings. Should we be moving away from that word? How can we best navigate that when we know from racial equity experts that using race explicit language is vital to advancing racial equity? So a question like that might be on your mind too. And we are really lucky that we have two people here who've been willing to join us for a conversation and share their perspectives on this, have a lot to say on the topic. Rinku Sen from the Narrative Initiative, many of you are probably familiar with her work here and at Race Forward. And then Veronica Selsler from Hadaway Communications, who has been behind a project that one of our members, Lumina Foundation, has brought them in to help with, is also exploring racial equity for higher ed and how that word is in that space. So I'm going to take down my share screen so that we can see the full group. And I'd love to first turn to Rinku. Rinku, what signals have you observed in your work or have you experienced that racial equity is sending? And I'm curious, in this spectrum I set up about people who are using it more and people who are using it less, like where do you fall or what do you see in that spectrum as well? I'd love to just get your top thoughts on that.
Thank you so much, Amy, and thanks everybody for joining. That was really, really fascinating research, and I'm so glad to be able to see it. So I want to say a couple of things and then tell a story and then say a couple more things, if that's okay. I'm going to have my timer on. So I am in this webinar as the person who will hold up the explicit position. That has been my life's work for at least 25 years, really putting racial justice and eventually equity on collective tables, community tables. And to get to the end at the beginning, my answer about should we say it or not is it depends on what your strategy is and who you're trying to recruit to do what. But over time, we have to be able to name a problem in order to solve it. So whether you're saying racial equity right now or not, the larger question, a decision about which I can have a lot of flexibility depending on your strategy. The larger question is when and how are you going to engage the ideas? The idea that structural racism is an obstacle to proper democracy, that in fact we don't run on meritocracy, we run on something else. Those ideas are really important to how we shape the economy and civics and social life of this society, the culture of this society. So when and how you do it is a matter of strategy, and there's a lot of flexibility there. But over time, we have to rebuild the narrative power to be able to say whatever we want to say that we think needs to be said in the pursuit of racial justice and fairness, and also a society that actually works for most people. Here's the story. Showing up for racial justice, group of mostly liberal white people who came together after the election of Donald Trump. By the summer of 2020, they could figure out that the white people they were organizing were not the white people who needed to be organized. They were well-to-do, well-educated, coastal urban center people. And that just wasn't who needed to be recruited into a multiracial coalition. So they built something else called Southern Crossroads. You will note that racial justice doesn't appear anywhere in the name Southern Crossroads. They hired local organizers. They went into southern states, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, and they started building in largely white counties groups that were concerned about affordable housing and about the environment and about their healthcare and about jobs and education. And those groups then over time those local groups join a statewide coalition that is concerned with those same things. So they made a tactical decision based on the constituency that they thought they were best equipped to bring into these processes. Maybe I have 1 minute left. So I want to say why we started using racial equity in the first place. We started using it because by the late 80s and early 90s, the word equality, which you'll notice doesn't have racial in front of it in how many people use it and relate to it, equality had started to mean sameness and identical treatment. So when you went into policy rooms, legislators would be like, well, why should we create anything that focuses on a particular community or demographic or constituency? Everything should be universal. But the history of this country is that people of color have been left out of many universal things. So sameness, identical treatment was not doing us any favors by the time we were trying to protect civil rights and expand them in the 90s. And so we hit equity as meaning the treatment that everybody needs to get to a good place. I think targeted universalism is a phrase that's very important to this conversation. And equity, we have universal goals, everybody's doing well, but we need targeted strategies for particular communities. I'm going to close this section by saying I'm actually encouraged by your research. If we had run the same research 10 years ago, just the familiarity with racial equity would have been a lot lower. And I think there are lots of interventions we can make to build narrative power that will take various amounts of time. Some of them are slower than others. But in the moment of making strategy, you have to let your strategy lead you to your decisions about when and how you engage particular words with the people that you're organizing or supporting or partnering with.
Awesome. Thanks, Rinku. That gives us so much to think about, especially that sameness with equality, and then where word like racial equity is actually an evolution of a longer arc, like you were saying there. Thanks for sharing that. We'll come back to you for some more questions too, but I want to turn to Veronica. So like I mentioned earlier, I know you guys did some research and it was just plainly labeled talking about racial equity and racial justice. So let's cut to the chase here too. What did you guys learn from that research that you did really, and correct me if I have this wrong, really to help understand how a term like racial equity is operating in the higher ed space? And what can we, as mostly a funding crew here, learn from that research as we think about advancing democracy?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me here, being able to share the work that we did at Hadaway with Lumina Foundation. So it's a pleasure to be here alongside you, Rinku. And I really am bringing that perspective of communications as a strategic tool, as you're saying, Rinku. And Lumina came to us with this challenge back in 2018, knew that their goal, wanting to ensure more people can earn a meaningful credential or degree after high school, the data made it very clear that racial equity was fundamental to meaningfully accomplishing that. They also knew that they needed to engage a really wide set of audiences, from progressive activists that they were funding and supporting and partnering with, to policymakers in red states that they needed to adopt certain legislation. And so that question was really kind of at the heart, how do we engage that wide set of audiences with a consistent set of concepts about the idea of racial equity? And that was kind of at the heart of the research that we've been doing with them. Is like, what does this thing mean? What does it mean to Lumina? What does it mean to people? How do we square that and figure out the framework and then the right words, depending on who we're talking to really move that forward, and move the work forward, right? Using our language, using communications as a tool to get stuff done. And in research, it's always so interesting to look at the data that you have to share, Pace, because similarly, we asked questions. We actually asked that open-ended question around equity. You asked about racial equity. We asked about equity, nothing like opening up a survey and the first question is an open-ended, what does equity mean to you? And we gave a couple opportunities for people to define it. We know that it has multiple definitions, coded all of those pre-ChatGPT days. We actually did this in 2019 and then again in 2022. Clearly very interesting moments in the conversations and kind of visibility of the language of equity. The thing that was really, really interesting in that is the number of people who gave some sort of relevant definition, whether or not we agreed with it. But they knew what we were talking about, went from 52% of some relevant definition to 58% from 2019 to 2022. So I think that self-identification to say like, yep, I get it. I've heard of this term. I'm aware of it is one thing. And then as soon as you ask them to define it, kind of opens up a whole other set of interesting kinds of responses. And so those definitions, as you shared, they vary really, really widely. We're hearing opportunity, fair, impartial, as you're saying, Rinku, that idea of sameness and equality continuing to be top of mind for people in the way that they are defining this word equity when we're going to the general public. And that's really important for us to be aware of, because those ideas that are in people's heads are not always in our favor. They're activating often unhelpful or inaccurate ideas to really get in the way of what we're actually trying to do. So to fast forward some of the things that came out of that, led to a framework for an effective working definition of the elements of what racial equity means. And at the heart of it was this idea of real opportunity as a way to define equity. People across demographics believe that the word opportunity is important, that real opportunity is important. It hasn't been co-opted in ways that we've seen a lot of other words. But importantly, you can't say just opportunity because it doesn't end there, but to acknowledge that opportunity isn't real for everyone. And that allows then to open up conversations around what's getting in the way. What are those barriers? Let's name them, let's be specific, and allows us to then point to really specific solutions that make opportunity real. And so would just affirm, Rinku, same page, it depends on whether to use the term, but to be really pointed in what we mean by it and figure out how it fits in being able to really advance the vision for the audiences that we're talking to.
Thanks, Veronica. Yeah, I think we get asked a question. We name this webinar the exact question we get asked all the time. Should I say racial equity? And we're in the same boat as you guys. And I think it's probably the not satisfying answer for when people ask us that question is like, well, what are you trying to do? Here's what might work. Here's what it's like you really have to consider so many other variables. Some of you may be users of it, but part of this project, we have partnered with Pluralytics, which is an AI tool that allows us to put in any piece of content and it'll score it against certain benchmarks that we're trying to reach and then offer a rewrite to more effectively reach that group. It's been a really interesting tool for us to consider. Are we effectively reaching Gen Z? Is this the way we say this going to hit rural folks? Lots of different ways to look at it. We have been struggling to have this robot, artificial intelligence, tell us how to talk about racial equity. We have put through so many pieces of content, and it either tells us like nothing available or it's not really giving us anything different, which I just think really underlines how challenging this is, right? That we are having trouble with it. We're having trouble with it in our conversations, and artificial intelligence is having trouble with it. And so I guess just to say, if you're here because you're looking for some answers, I totally get that. There are very few to offer, but we do have space to think out loud together as how we navigate that. I wasn't going to do this, but we do have enough time for a question or two. So I want to see if there's anybody in the room who has something that they want to hold up. I'll take hands, and then if not, I see Sarah's question here too. But anybody want to voice something, a question into the room? Okay, let's go to Sarah's question then. Do the narrative experts feel that their own thinking about equity, opportunities, challenges change when the language they find works with not usual suspects audiences?
That may not have been very clear. I'm just
No worries,
because
Sarah.
because both Rinku and Veronica were talking about the work of finding language that allows them to talk to other audiences is not necessarily the language they would use. I'm curious, in that process of coming up with language that opens people up to conversations, actually changes your own thinking about your work and defining the problems and identifying opportunities for change.
I can start here. I mean, I will just say, yeah, absolutely. What a fantastic and important question, because I think that has been almost at the heart of this process, which has been an expectation in a field where there's almost an expectation to use the jargon of the field. Jargon, I mean, in a really powerful kind of important, both signaling and advancing key issues way. And also then forcing myself and the folks that we're working with to think about what we really mean by that and get really tangible and really specific. Because that is the only way that, that's what we've found is the most important way to be able to really engage folks who are going to be resistant to these terms, who are unclear, unfamiliar, skeptical, is to say what we mean. I mean, it's sort of straightforward, but it's, what are we actually trying to create? What world are we trying to create? What's getting in the way? What can we do about it? And by doing that, I think it's compelled so much smarter, more refined thinking about the idea of racial equity, which actually is better for making real progress.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I think for me, what's happened over the many years I've been doing this work is that I've stopped thinking about communications as self-expression. The purpose of organizational and movement communications is something strategic, and it usually has to do with an audience. So putting that audience first instead of me first. So the read is not like, am I comfortable saying this? The read, the kind of outcome is, did I make any progress with the person or people that I'm trying to reach? And it doesn't have to be like 0 to 100% progress. It can be 10% to 20% progress. So audience first. And I think, Veronica, you're the first person saying the word jargon in this hour, and it's a very important word. In general, we all have to de-jargon everything. Jargon, regardless of whether the word is feminism or racial equity or reproductive justice or whatever, global warming, jargon is an obstacle to engagement. And there aren't any magic words. Like, just because you say racial equity doesn't mean you're making racial equity. So audience first, de-jargon as much as we can. And then I'll just say one last thing that has changed for me, or a realization that a lot of how we've communicated about what racial equity is and what needs to happen is through racial disparities data. And I don't think that data is doing the entire narrative job that we think it's doing. We think it's convincing people that structural racism exists and changes need to be made. But a lot of times it's just convincing people that communities of color have deficits. So I think as a field, we need to do less disparities data and actually more research that proves structural discrimination and proves why the solutions we're proposing are the right solutions. So that's an actual strategic pivot that we could make through our research. And that would eventually affect what we're communicating about to.
I want to just briefly add on that, kind of build on that final point that you made around the use of data. Internally, data about racial disparities, super useful to figure out where to put energy. Externally, the data around talking about this policy differences, talk about the practice, talk about the experience differences. That is where you actually get people to really see what it means rather than making it easy to blame. So yeah, really appreciate that point.
Awesome. Jarvis, I see your hand, but actually we're getting close to the top of the hour. So if you want to put your question in the chat, I'll make sure I take it in and if I can follow up with you as well. But before we close, I'm going to do two things. One is to let you know, well, I'm going to do a quick poll. If you guys could go ahead and fill out these 4 questions, so we just kind of get a sense of where you guys learned, so it can shape our learning moving forward. I want to let you guys know that there's a lot of resources available for you. We know we're doing these kind of quick 1 hour, here's a lot of analysis, here's some questions. It can feel like a lot and pretty dense. So we have made everything available on our website, pacefunders.org/language. You can find an interactive dashboard of all of this research. You can do your own analysis. You can find a way to request that we do data visualizations on something that you are particularly interested in learning about. We have access to that AI tool if you want to learn more about that. And we have, of course, a webinar series. So recordings available for, should we say, patriotism and what should we say to Gen Z? And then this one will be up later this week. And then in July, we're looking into what should we say to rural communities. We know that's an entire group that folks are really trying to think about how to communicate with. And then we'll wrap up in August on should we say democracy, which is really kind of the penultimate question, I think, of this project overall, and something we're going to dig into pretty deeply, knowing that a lot of the signals for that word people have been feeling like are shifting pretty rapidly, particularly in a year like 2024. So that's what's available to you all. Thank you for filling out the survey. And just want to thank you all for joining. This is really an ongoing exploration for us. And if you are still hot on some questions related to racial equity, when to use it, should I not say it? This was not meant to be a webinar that gave you necessarily that answer, but we do hope the analysis that we presented gives you some beginnings to answer that question for yourself. Here's who it's resonating with, here who it's not resonating with, here's where the unfamiliarity pockets are, and then the conversation with Veronica and Rinku kind of opening up our mind to think about how we might approach these really hard and really important questions that we're asking ourselves about, frankly, how do we steward this concept into the next era of the American experiment? So thank you all for joining. I'm available for follow-up if you need anything from me, and just really appreciate your time today. Thanks, everybody.